The distress signal was old. Not old like yesterday or last week. Old like nobody had used that frequency in 15 years. Dan Harlow heard it crackle through his cockpit speakers, and his hands froze on the controls. Finn looked up from her navigation screen. "What is that?" "Medical emergency code," Dan said quietly. "Military grade. From the old colonial wars. So it is ancient junk. Some busted satellite bouncing garbage signals." Finn leaned back and crossed her arms. "We are already 2 days behind on this delivery, Dan. If we miss the drop window at Erebos, we do not get paid." Dan knew she was right. The Driftway was no place for detours. Unregulated trade lanes full of pirates, scavengers, and worse. You kept your head down, ran your cargo, and you did not stop for anything that was not your business. But that code. He had not heard it since his days as a combat medic. It meant someone was dying and had no other way to call for help. "I'm going to check it out," he said. "Done. 20 minutes. If it is nothing, we leave." Finn swore under her breath, but adjusted their course. They found the source near an asteroid cluster. A small shuttle, barely bigger than a lifeboat, drifting with its engines dead. Scorch marks ran along the hull. Someone had been shooting at it. Dan docked their cargo ship alongside and cycled the airlock. The shuttle's interior was dark and cold. Emergency lighting painted everything in dull red. He smelled blood before he saw it. An alien woman lay against the far wall. Sarati. He recognized the pale blue skin and the delicate bone structure. She was old, dressed in what had once been fine diplomatic robes, now torn and soaked through. Her breathing was shallow and wet. "Please," she whispered when she saw him. Her galactic comment was broken, but clear enough. "Please. Not for me. For the child." Dan looked where her trembling hand pointed. A sealed compartment in the shuttle wall. He opened it carefully. Inside was a small Sarati girl. She could not have been more than the equivalent of 6 years old. Huge dark eyes stared up at him from a pale blue face. She was clutching a small cloth toy shaped like some animal Dan did not recognize. She did not scream. She did not cry. She just stared at him with the kind of silence that only comes from being terrified for a very long time. Dan knelt down slowly. "Hey, it is okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The child pressed herself further into the compartment. The old woman spoke again. "Her name is Lyra. She is the last. They killed everyone else. The council, the ministers, her family. All of them. She is the last of the bloodline." Finn had come aboard behind Dan. She stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. "Done? What is this?" "Sarati," he said. "The hegemony purge. You heard the rumors. Rumors are not our problem." The old woman, who Dan would later learn was Elder Sola, grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "The hegemony want her dead. If she dies, the Sarati claim to their homeworld dies with her. They will erase us completely. Please, take her somewhere safe. Anywhere." Dan looked at Sola's wounds. He had seen enough injuries in his life to know. She was not going to last more than a few hours. There was nothing his old medic skills could do for damage this severe. "I am not a soldier," he said. "I am a cargo hauler." "You are a human," Sola said, as if that word meant something more than he understood. Finn pulled them aside near the airlock. "We cannot do this. We are nobodies. We move freight. That child has the entire hegemony military hunting for her, and you want to put her on our ship. I want to get her to Erebos. That is it. We hand her off to someone who can actually help. A diplomat, a resistance contact, anyone. We just get her there. And if the hegemony catches us before that." Dan did not answer. He walked back to the compartment and held out his hand to Lyra. She did not take it. She just watched him with those enormous dark eyes, gripping her toy so hard her small fingers had gone white that he did not force it. He simply said, "I'm going to take you somewhere warm. There's food on my ship. You can bring your toy." Lyra looked past him at Sola. The old woman nodded and spoke a few words in the Sarati language. Something soft and gentle. Lyra climbed out of the compartment on her own. She did not take Dan's hand, but she followed him through the airlock and onto his ship. She moved like a shadow, silent and small, staying close to the walls. Finn watched her pass, and something shifted in her expression. Not agreement. Not yet. But something cracked in the hard shell she kept around herself. They transferred Sola as well, laying her on a cot in the cargo bay. Dan did what he could for her wounds. Knowing it would not be enough, he was settling Lyra into a corner of the crew cabin with a blanket when Finn called from the cockpit. Her voice was flat and controlled, which meant she was scared. Done? Sensors just picked up 3 ships entering the sector. Venery military configuration. They are running a search pattern. Dan stood up. Lyra looked at him. She still had not said a word, but her hand reached out and grabbed the edge of his jacket, just barely, with 2 tiny fingers that he looked down at her. Then he walked to the cockpit. "Get us out of here," he said. "Now." Finn fired the engines, and the old cargo ship groaned forward into the dark. Behind them, the Venery patrol ships tightened their search grid. Nobody tells you how quiet fear is. In the movies, it is all screaming and explosions. But real fear, the kind that sits inside your bones, is silent. The cargo ship moved through the dark with its lights dimmed and its engine signature masked, and the only sound was the hum of the air recycler. Lyra had not moved from the corner of the crew cabin. The blanket Dan had given her was pulled up to her chin. Her cloth toy sat on her lap. The food he had left on a tray beside her was untouched. Dan sat across the room, pretending to read a maintenance log on his datapad. He was not reading. He was watching her from the edge of his vision, trying to figure out how to help a child who was too afraid to eat. He tried speaking to her once. Just a simple question. "Are you hungry?" She flinched like he had raised his hand. He backed off immediately. He moved the tray a little closer to her and then walked away. Give her space. Let her decide that in the cargo bay, Solo was getting worse. Dan changed her bandages and gave her the last of his pain medication. Her pale blue skin had turned almost gray. She knew she was dying. There was no pretending otherwise. "You need to understand what they did," Sola told him, her voice barely above a whisper. "The hegemony did not just invade. They manufactured everything. False border attacks, fake evidence of Sarati aggression. They presented it to the council, and the council voted to authorize military action. 3 species objected. They were removed from the council the next day." "Why?" Dan asked. "Why go after a peaceful species? Territory, resources, and fear." Sola coughed, and blood spotted her lips. "The Sarati held a key vote on the council. We were building alliances with younger species, humans included. The elder races did not like that." She reached into her robe and pulled out a small data chip. It was scratched and worn, but the indicator light still glowed green. "This contains everything. Communications between Grand Arbiter Razak and the Venery Military Command. Orders for the purge. Financial records showing payments to mercenary groups. Testimony from Sarati officials who were given a choice between silence and death." She pressed it into Dan's hand. "If this reaches the right people, the hegemony falls apart. Every species in the galaxy will see what they truly are." Dan held the chip and felt its weight. Not physical weight. The other kind. Fenn appeared in the doorway. "The Venery ships are still behind us. They have not locked on yet, but they are matching our general heading. We need to decide. The hegemony checkpoint at Relay 4 is 12 hours ahead, or we go through the Pale Corridor." Dan knew the Pale Corridor. Everyone on the Driftway knew it. A long stretch of dead space between 2 systems. No stations, no patrols, no communication relays. Ships went in, and some of them came out. You crossed it if you were desperate or stupid. "The checkpoint is a trap," Solas said. "They will have our description. Every hegemony station will. The Pale Corridor is 3 days with no support," Fenn said. "If anything goes wrong in there, nobody is coming." Dan looked at Sola. He looked at the data chip in his hand. He looked toward the crew cabin where Lyra sat in her corner, silent. "We take the corridor," he said. Finn closed her eyes for a second. Then she nodded and went back to the cockpit. Sola reached for Dan's arm. "I will not make the crossing. You know that." "I know. Take care of her. She's not just a symbol or a political tool. She's a child. A frightened child who has lost everything." "I know that too." Sola asked him to bring Lyra to her. Dan went to the crew cabin and knelt near the little girl. He did not reach for her. He just said, "Someone wants to see you." Lyra looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up, holding her toy against her chest, and followed him to the cargo bay. When Lyra saw Sola, something broke open in her face. The careful blankness she had been wearing crumbled. She ran to the old woman and pressed her face against her shoulder. Sola wrapped one weak arm around her and spoke in the Serati language. Soft words, gentle words, words Dan could not understand, but felt in his chest anyway. Lyra cried. It was the first sound she had made since Dan found her. Small, choked sobs that shook her whole body. Sola spoke for a long time. Then she looked at Dan over the child's head. "I told her you were safe. I told her your kind protects the small and the lost. I told her your people are strange and loud and impossible, but they do not abandon their wounded." She paused. "Do not make me a liar. I will not." Sola died 2 hours later, quietly, while Lyra slept next to her on the cot. Dan lifted the old woman's body and carried it to the airlock. Finn said a few words, then could not think of any. He opened the airlock and let the darkness take her. When he went back inside, Lyra was awake. She was sitting on the cot where Sola had been, her toy in her lap, tears running silently down her blue cheeks. Dan sat on the floor near the cot. Not too close. Close enough that he did not say anything. There was nothing to say. After a long time, Lyra's small hand reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his jacket. She held on tight and did not let go. Dan sat there in the dim light of the cargo bay, feeling the tiny grip on his sleeve, and the ship carried them both into the pale corridor. 3 days is not a long time. Unless you're hiding in a dead stretch of space with no stars, no stations, and no way to call for help. Then 3 days feels like 3 years. Dan kept the ship running on reduced power. Lights stayed low. Heat stayed low. Meals were rationed carefully because he had loaded supplies for 2 people, not 3, and the pale corridor did not have a grocery store. Lyra still barely spoke, but she had started eating small, careful bites of the ration bars Dan left near her, and that felt like a victory. She watched everything he did with those enormous dark eyes. When he moved around the ship, her head would follow him. When he sat down, she would sit nearby. Not next to him, not yet, but nearby. Dan did not push. He had learned enough about frightened creatures, human and otherwise, to know that trust cannot be forced. It grows on its own, or it does not grow at all. He started talking. Not to her exactly, just out loud, near her about nothing important. He told her about his ship, how old it was, how the left engine made a funny noise when it started up cold, how Finn had once accidentally jettisoned an entire shipment of frozen fish because she pressed the wrong button. Finn, passing through the cabin, said, "That was one time, and the labels were wrong." Lyra's eyes moved to Finn. Something almost like interest flickered across her face that on the second day, Dan sat on the floor of the crew cabin during the meal period. He pulled out a worn deck of cards. Real paper cards, old and soft from years of handling. He started laying them out in a simple pattern game his mother had taught him when he was small. Lyra watched from her corner. After a few minutes, she crept closer, not all the way, but close enough to see what he was doing. Dan did not look at her directly. He just kept playing, turning cards over, matching pairs. He left a small space on the floor beside him. B, why the third round. Lyra was sitting in that space. She pointed at a card. Dan turned it over. It matched and he smiled. She did not smile back, but she pointed at another card. They played for an hour. That night, while Lyra slept, Finn sat in the cockpit monitoring the communications array. She had been scanning hegemony broadcasts when she could pick them up, catching fragments between the dead zones. Done. Her voice was flat. Come look at this. He read the intercepted broadcast on her screen and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The hegemony was not just occupying the Serati homeworld. They were dismantling it. Cultural archives destroyées. Historical sites demolished. Remaining Serati citizens relocated to labor facilities on mining worlds. Official records were being rewritten to minimize the Serati contribution to galactic history. They were not just killing a species. They were erasing one. Finn looked at him. Why does this one matter to you? I have known you for 6 years. We have hauled cargo past war zones and refugee convoys, and you never blinked. What is different? Dan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 12 years ago, colony evacuation on the Outer Rim. I was still a combat medic. We had a transport full of wounded civilians. Command said, leave them. The enemy was closing in and the transport was too slow. If we waited, we would lose the whole unit. What did you do? I followed orders. We left them. The cockpit was silent except for the hum of the instruments. I heard later that a second unit picked them up. Most of them survived, but I did not know that when I left. I thought I was leaving them to die, and I did it because someone told me to. He rubbed his face with both hands. I'm not doing that again. Finn did not say anything else. She turned back to her screen. On the third day, midway through the corridor, they flew into a graveyard. Old ships, dozens of them, drifting in a loose cluster. Some were ancient. Some were recent enough to still have power flickering in their windows. The pale corridor collected the dead like dust collects in corners. Dan was navigating carefully through the wreckage when the proximity alarm screamed. Scavengers. 2 small, fast ships came out from behind a gutted freighter. They latched onto the hull before Finn could accelerate. Dan heard the grinding sound of a boarding clamp locking on. Cargo bay, Finn said, already reaching for the emergency controls. Dan grabbed a heavy wrench from the tool rack and ran. The airlock was cycling when he got there. 3 figures came through, ragged, desperate, armed with cutting tools and shock prods. Not professionals, just people who had been in the corridor too long and needed what he had that he did not give them time to talk. The first one went down when the wrench connected with his weapon hand. The second, one Dan shoved into the wall hard enough to crack the panel behind him. The third jabbed a shock prod at his ribs. Pain lit up his side, but he caught the prod, twisted it away, and drove his elbow into the scavenger's throat. Finn sealed the inner airlock and vented the outer section. The remaining boarders were swept into space. Dan sat on the cargo bay floor, breathing hard, his ribs burning where the prod had hit him. Finn came down with a medical kit and started cleaning a cut on his arm. Lyra appeared in the doorway. She walked over slowly and sat beside him. Her small hand pressed flat against his palm to palm. She said one word, soft and careful in the Serati language. Finn looked it up on her data pad later. IT meant safe. Dan closed his eyes. His ribs ached. His arm was bleeding. And a tiny alien girl had just told him he was safe. They cleared the pale corridor the next morning. Erebos Station's beacon appeared on their sensors like a heartbeat in the dark. But beside it, a hegemony alert flashed across every frequency. Dan's ship ID was flagged. His face was on a bounty notice. They could not go home the easy way. Grace Okoro had been retired for 5 years. She had served 22 years as a human diplomatic attaché on Erebos Station before her government quietly told her that her approach to alien relations was too aggressive. She disagreed. She thought her approach was exactly aggressive enough. So she retired, stayed on Erebos, and opened a small tea shop on the lower levels where she sold overpriced drinks to traders and listened to every rumor that moved through the station. When Dan's encrypted message reached her, she was pouring tea for a venery merchant. She read the message twice, set down the teapot, and told the merchant the shop was closing early. Dan docked at a secondary maintenance port on the station's underside. Finn had rigged a false transponder code, borrowed from a ship they had passed in the corridor that would never need it again. It would not hold up under real inspection, but it got them through the automated docking system. Getting Lyra through the station was the hard part. Dan wrapped her in a cargo blanket and carried her against his chest like a bundle of freight. Lyra held very still. She had gotten good at holding still. Grace met them in a storage room behind her tea shop. She was a tall woman with gray hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Dan, then at Finn, then at the small blue face peering out from the cargo blanket. "Tell me everything," she said. Dan told her. The distress signal, Sola, the data chip, the pale corridor. All of it. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she held out her hand for the chip. She plugged it into a secure reader and scrolled through the contents. Her expression did not change, but her jaw tightened. "This is enough to bring down the entire Hegemony Council," she said. "Direct communications between Razak and the Venery Command. Execution orders with his personal seal. Financial transfers to mercenary groups. This is not just evidence of a crime. This is evidence of a conspiracy involving every senior member of the council. So send it out," Finn said. "Broadcast it everywhere." It is not that simple. The Hegemony controls 80% of galactic communication networks. Any broadcast I send from here gets scrubbed within minutes. The only way to get this out to every species simultaneously is through the assembly beacon. Dunfroenet, the one on the Hegemony Capital Station, the same. It is designed for emergency broadcast to every system in the network. Cannot be filtered, cannot be blocked. It overrides every channel. But it is sitting in the most heavily guarded station in the galaxy. The room was quiet. "There is a resistance network," Grace continued. "Small, careful. Representatives from 4 species who oppose the council privately. They have contacts on the capital station. They can get someone inside. But someone has to physically carry the chip to the beacon and operate the console. Someone meaning a human," Dan said. "Someone meaning you. You're already a dead man walking as far as the Hegemony is concerned. And frankly, you're the only person in this room stubborn enough to do it." Before anyone could respond, Finn's communicator buzzed. She checked it and her face went pale. Venery Strike Team just docked at the main port. Commander draw. Full military escort. They're already searching the upper levels. Grace moved fast for someone who had been retired for 5 years. She led them through a series of maintenance tunnels beneath the station's commercial district. The tunnels were cramped and dark and smelled like recycled coolant. Lyra clung to Dan's neck with her arms wrapped tight, her face pressed against his shoulder. They could hear boots above them. Venery soldiers moved in precise, rhythmic steps. Insects by biology and soldiers by training. They searched methodically every room, every corridor, every shop. Grace brought them to a junction where the tunnel split 3 ways. Left goes to the lower docks. Right goes to the waste processing level. Straight ahead leads to my shuttle bay. A sound echoed from behind them. Boots in the tunnel. Getting closer. They ran. Finn led the way with Grace, directing from behind. Dan carried Lyra and kept his hand over her head to protect her from the low ceiling. The tunnel narrowed until they were nearly crawling. They came around a corner and stopped. A single Venery soldier stood in the passage ahead. Young, by the look of his markings. His weapon was raised. Dan held Lyra behind him. Finn reached for the shock prod she had taken from the scavengers. Grace put a hand on Finn's arm and shook her head. Lyra moved. She stepped out from behind Dan before he could stop her. She stood in the narrow tunnel, barely reaching the soldier's waist, and looked up at him. She spoke in Galactic Common. Her voice was small but clear. "Why do you want to hurt me? I have not done anything." The soldier stared at her. His weapon stayed raised. Then it lowered, just slightly. Dan stepped forward, grabbed the weapon's barrel, and twisted it out of the soldier's hands in one motion. Finn moved past and put the soldier down with the shock prod. Clean and quiet. They reached Grace's shuttle bay and sealed the door behind them. Grace turned to Dan while Finn prepped the shuttle. I will get the chip to the resistance contacts. They will arrange transport to the capital system. But I need to know right now. Are you going to carry this the rest of the way? Dan looked at Lyra. She was sitting on a crate, her cloth toy in her lap, watching him. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were so small, they only wrapped around two of his. Yes, he said. Grace nodded. Then we moved tonight. The convoy was not impressive. 5 ships. 3 were passenger shuttles held together by patch welds and hope. One was a light freighter that had seen better decades. The last was Dan's battered cargo ship, which fit right into Grace's resistance contacts had come through. Representatives from 4 species, all of them serving on the Hegemony Council's lower committees, all of them quietly furious about what had been done to the Serati. They had arranged safe passage codes and a maintenance port entry on the capital station. Everything depended on timing and silence. The journey to the capital system took 6 days. Dan spent most of it with Lyra. She was changing, slowly, like ice melting in a warm room. She still did not talk much, but when she did, it was not just single words anymore. She asked questions, small ones at first. What does that sound? Why does the ship shake? What are those lights outside? Then bigger ones. Where are we going? Will the soldiers find us? Are you scared? Dan answered every question honestly. We are going somewhere important. Maybe. And yes. She started teaching him Serati words. She would point at something and say the word, then wait for him to repeat it. He was terrible at it. The Serati language had sounds that human throats were not built to make. Every time he mangled a word, Lyra would shake her head very seriously and say it again. Finn watched this from the cockpit doorway one evening and almost smiled. It was Finn who started braiding Lyra's hair. The Serati did not have hair exactly, but they had thin, silvery filaments that grew from their scalps in soft waves. Finn showed Lyra a simple human braid pattern. Lyra sat perfectly still while Finn worked, then ran to the small mirror in the washroom to look at herself. She came back and pointed at Finn's hair. Finn leaned down. Lyra tried to braid it. The result was a tangled mess that took 20 minutes to undo. But Lyra was smiling. It was the first time Dan had seen her smile. He had to walk to the cargo bay for a minute after that. Finn found him there, standing with his back to the door, breathing slowly. "You okay?" she asked. She smiled. "I saw. I cannot let anything happen to her, Finn." "I know." On the 5th day, they entered the outer boundary of the capital system. The convoy tightened formation and went silent on all channels. The capital station sat at the system's center, a massive structure orbiting a gas giant. It was beautiful in the way that powerful things are beautiful, cold and vast and untouchable. They were 12 hours from the station when the Venery warships appeared. 3 heavy cruisers dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly in the convoy's path. Commander Drall's flagship was at the center. He had tracked them. How Dan did not know, but Drall had found them. The convoy scattered. 2 of the rebel ships tried to run. The Venery cruisers fired. Not warning shots. Kill shots. Both ships broke apart in silence. Dan slammed the engines to full. Finn worked the controls beside him, weaving through debris. The remaining convoy ships spread out, drawing fire away from each other. It was not a plan. It was desperation. Their ship took a hit on the port side. The hull screamed. Emergency seals activated. Lyra was strapped into the crew cabin, clutching her toy, her eyes wide, but her mouth set in a thin, determined line. Finn found a gap in the Venery formation, a narrow window between 2 cruisers where their firing arcs overlapped and created a blind spot. She punched through it at full speed. The ship shook so hard Dan's teeth rattled. They reached the capital station and docked at the maintenance port. The access codes worked. Grace's contacts had held up their end. Inside the station, Dan and Finn moved fast. a resistance contact, a nervous-looking official from a species Dan did not recognize, met them at the dock and led them through service corridors to a safe room deep in the station's lower levels. Finn would stay here with Lyra. Dan would go to the beacon alone, that he knelt in front of Lyra. She looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. I have to go do something, he said. Finn is going to stay with you. Where are you going? To tell everyone the truth about what happened to your people. Lyra reached out and touched his face with her small hand. She said a Sarati word he had learned. It meant come back. I will try, he said. He took the data chip and walked into the corridor alone. The beacon chamber was in the station's central tower. Dan made it through 2 security checkpoints using the resistance contact's access codes before the corridors became too well guarded for codes to help. He moved through maintenance shafts and ventilation passages, climbing, crawling, working his way upward. He was 1 level below the beacon chamber when a voice stopped him. Human. Commander Drawl stood at the end of the passage. Tall, armored, alone, no soldiers behind him. Just him and Dan in a gray corridor. Dan did not reach for a weapon. He did not have one. I know about the child, Drawl said. I know what that chip contains. Then you know what I am about to do. I know what you think you are about to do. Dan looked at the Venery commander. The insectoid face was unreadable, but the voice was not. There was something in it. Something tired. Step aside, Dan said. Not for politics. Not for species or empires. For one child who never hurt anyone. The silence lasted 5 seconds. It felt like 5 years. Drawl stepped aside. Dan walked past him and entered the beacon chamber. The beacon console was older than Dan expected. Heavy metal switches and thick glass displays. Built in an era when the galaxy still believed in things that lasted. It sat in the center of a circular chamber at the top of the station's central tower, surrounded by reinforced walls and blast doors that were currently wide open because nobody had ever imagined someone would actually break in here. Dan plugged the data chip in the console. The system recognized it immediately. A prompt appeared on the screen, asking for broadcast authorization that he pressed confirm. The upload began. A progress bar crawled across the screen. Estimated time to full broadcast, 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Then a second prompt appeared. Manual override required. To broadcast at full emergency power across all channels. The override switch had to be held in the active position for the entire duration of the transmission. Release the switch and the broadcast stops. Dan looked at the switch. It was a simple metal lever on the side of the console. Pull it down and hold it. He pulled it down. His communicator crackled. Finn's voice, tight and controlled. Dan, we are on the shuttle. Lyra is with me. Are you done? Can you get out? He looked at the switch in his hand. He looked at the progress bar. 3 minutes and 50 seconds remaining. Finn, launch the shuttle. Get Lyra out of the system. What? No. Finish and get down here. We are at Maintenance Dock 7. The broadcast needs a manual hold. If I let go, it stops. Silence on the line. Then Finn's voice, and it was not controlled anymore. Done? Find something to jam it. Wedge it with a tool. Tie it down. He had already tried. The switch was spring-loaded and recessed. It required constant downward pressure from a hand. Nothing yet would hold it. There is no other way, Finn. Do not do this to me. Do not you dare do this to me. Take care of her. Teach her human things. Card games and braids and bad jokes. And let her teach you the Sarati things. Do not let anyone forget who her people were. Finn was crying. He could hear it through the static. You stubborn, impossible man. I need you to promise me. I promise. I promise. Done. Then a smaller voice came through the communicator. Lyra. Done? His throat closed. He swallowed hard. Hey, little one. Done? She said his name like she was holding it carefully, like it was something precious. Then she said the Sarati word he knew, the one that meant safe. Then she said another word, one he had not heard before. It was longer, softer, with a sound at the end that rose like a question, but was not a question. Finn, he said. What did she say? Finn's voice broke. She said, "Father." Dan closed his eyes. 2 minutes and 40 seconds that he could hear alarms now. Hegemony security had been alerted. Boots on metal, getting louder, coming from below. Multiple teams. "Go," he told Finn. "Right now. Do not wait." The communicator went dead as the shuttle launched. Dan held the switch. The progress bar moved. 2 minutes. The first security team hit the blast doors. 6 Venery soldiers in full armor. They stopped when they saw him. One man, standing at the console, holding a switch, unarmed. "Step away from the console," the lead soldier ordered. Dan did not step away. They moved toward him. Then a sound behind them. A weapon firing. Commander Drahl appeared in the doorway, his sidearm drawn. He fired twice more. 3 soldiers went down. The others turned in confusion. "Drahl, what are you doing?" the lead soldier shouted. "Something I should have done a long time ago," Drahl said. The remaining soldiers opened fire on Drahl. He took 2 hits and kept fighting. He was Venery. They were built to endure. He held the doorway like a wall, firing, blocking, buying seconds that cost everything. 1 minute. Drahl went down. A shot through the chest plate. He fell against the door frame and slid to the floor. But the seconds he had bought were enough. The progress bar hit 100%. The broadcast went out. Every channel, every frequency, every station, ship, colony, and outpost in the galaxy. The evidence of the hegemony's crimes against the Sorati played on every screen in known space. Communications from Grand Arbiter Razak. Execution orders. Financial records. Testimony. All of it, undeniable, pouring out across the stars like light. Dan let go of the switch. The remaining soldiers surrounded him. He did not fight. He sat down on the floor of the beacon chamber, exhausted, bleeding from where a stray shot had grazed his shoulder, and he closed his eyes. IT was done. The aftermath came in waves. Within days, 6 species withdrew from the Hegemony Council. Within weeks, the Sorati homeworld was declared a protected zone. Liberation ships arrived within a month. Razak was arrested. The council collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Finn took Lyra to a human colony world on the Outer Rim. She enrolled her in a school. She braided her hair every morning. She taught her card games and bad jokes and how to cook eggs, which Lyra found disgusting, but ate anyway. Dan survived. The hegemony held him for 3 months, but executing the man who had exposed their crimes to the entire galaxy was politically impossible. He was released quietly, without ceremony, and put on a transport that he arrived at the colony world on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was blue, the kind of blue that Earth had in old photographs. He walked across the landing field with his bag over his shoulder. Lyra saw him from the schoolyard. She dropped her bag and ran. She ran faster than he thought a Sorati child could run, her silver hair streaming behind her, her feet barely touching the ground. Dan knelt down and caught her. She wrapped her arms around his neck and said the word again. "Father." Other species would talk about humans differently after that. Not as reckless or emotional or dangerously unpredictable. They would say the humans are the species that will burn down an empire for one child they did not even know. And they would be right, but Dan did not think about empires or species or history. He just held his daughter and let the blue sky fill his eyes.